Weird Way Media.
Hello, twisted humans. Do you find yourself wanting to know more about the latest murder, conspiracy, cult, or haunting? Then this is the podcast for you. I'm Alicia. And I'm Sierra, and this is Twisted and Uncorked.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of your favorite podcast. This is a serial killer episode 165, part 1. And hopefully this will be a super fun 3-part special. I can't really give too much away today, but our serial killer is pretty rough. So get those beverages ready. And in the meantime, Sierra, do you have a fun topic? A fun fact for me? That's what I meant.
A fun topic.
A fun
Here's
topic.
a fun topic. No, I'll save that for later in case it gives it away. But okay, fun fact.
A fun topic. Fun fact, fun topic. Same.
There is a type of coffee, one of the most expensive coffees in the world. All right. It costs $1,300 per kilogram. It's often called the Holy Grail of coffees. This coffee comes from the coffee cherries pooped out by a civet.
What is a civet?
Like a raccoon cat thing.
Oh my god.
Yeah. It's called Kopi Luwak, this coffee. And it is literally an Asian civet. The civet poops out the coffee beans because after it goes through its digestive system, it does something to the coffee beans, I guess. And people enjoy that in their coffee. And I know you don't want to see this, but
no. Don't show me civet poop. Ah!
It's pooping out coffee cherries. And yeah, people fucking drink that coffee and pay $1,300 per kilogram to do it. So
that looks painful, first of all.
Yeah.
Second of all,
looks like a corn cob.
You know, now that I know where it came from, that would make me less inclined to try it, other than the cost. But I mean, to each their own.
Yeah, it's interesting.
That's one way to put it. If you guys have ever tried this super swanky coffee, let me know. But my fun fact is also animal related and short and sweet because, you know, serial killer episodes are usually our longer ones. And this actually comes from one of our listeners named Troy. He tagged us in this on Instagram. So thank you so much, Troy, for sharing this. And it is that when beavers are munching on trees and doing their thing, trying to, you know, get their wood for their dams, they take breaks and they listen to the sounds in the tree so that they don't get squished. And I think that that's super brilliant. And nature is super cool. And they cut trees down better than humans. So
that's crazy.
Yeah. The fun fact that we were tagged in was a video. And the video of it is pretty cool. It's literally like a 6-hour time lapse of this, but it like goes quickly, of this beaver just going to town and like listening and then stopping.
Yeah.
And then moving around and just like, and I'm like, that's so fucking cool. So nature, guys.
Nature.
Thank you for sharing. And if you have a fun fact you want to share with us, feel free to send it our way or tag us or do any of the things. And I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that you were going to need a glass of vino, of water, of whatever the heck you feel like sipping on. But you're going to need something. You're going to need to be cozy. I am cheating today because I didn't actually have time to pick up a bottle of red wine because I had a surprise little rabbit fun time yesterday. But I was going to pick up this bottle because it was on sale for $11.50 at my local wine store, and it is normally a $25 bottle of wine, and it is a French red I'm a sucker for a French red, so naturally I had to jump on this. It is Laurent Michel Vendegas Notres, and it is a mix of Grenache, Merlot, Kerrigan, and Shiraz, and it is grown in the French region of Languedoc Roussillon. And I'm really excited to try it when I do finally get to the liquor store. But it is fresh and supple. It is a red blend with aromas of red fruit and light spice. It is smooth in taste and has plenty of deep red fruit flavors. It's soft in terms of tannins and it has a nice little spiciness. So I imagine this will be a really good winter red for me. It sounds very heavy, very full-bodied, but I'm excited to drink it. And for our French listeners, I apologize in advance for all of what I just said. But I am a sucker for a French red, but right now I am just drinking a diet ginger ale in a Hard Rock Casino Las Vegas cup. So with my bone straw. What you got?
Just water.
I was gonna say, watch this be the time that Sierra has a red wine and she's repping alone. But I will let you guys know how it goes over the weekend. And if any of you live anywhere within a place that has everything wine, it seems to be for sale nationwide. So go check it out.
Nice.
It's like basically 50% off. But before we get into this week's serial killer, we are going to take a quick break and hear a promo from our friends over at West London Witch Podcast, and we will be right back.
This is my fun topic that I didn't say earlier because I wouldn't give away. I have covered this already on the other podcast that I did. So if I'm not like, what? Oh my God, it's because I already know what's happening. I already know it's fucking awful. But also when I covered it, I mentioned, and it's so hard to put into words even now, because you never know how to say it correctly, that this is my favorite serial killer.
Like you're the most
That's
interested
wrong.
in the story. We said this
Yes.
when we covered Ted Bundy as well. And we literally had like a 10-minute conversation about how
Right.
we don't know how to put that into words, which is fun
Yeah.
because now that brings us back to episode 1. But it's deeply fascinating. It's deeply disturbing.
This one is my favorite, if that's
Quote
the right
unquote.
word you can
Yeah.
use, because of obviously things that we will talk about as we get into it. But it has this huge moral conundrum, not about fucking Dean Corll himself, he's
No.
awful, but about Wayne, which we'll get there.
Mhm.
But yes, this
I was
thing
literally
drives
gonna
me crazy.
text you yesterday when I was finishing up the book because I'm like, on the one hand, yeah, we will get into it, guys, as we talk about it. But on the one hand, you feel deeply like angry that this situation happened at all because of the victims involved. And then on the other hand, you just feel so sad for this person and
Not Dean Corll.
yes, for Wayne Henley and even a little bit David Brooks. I mean, we don't know as much about David Brooks, but his actions at the end that Sierra will talk about in part 2 just aren't as admirable, like as you know, morally. I don't know how to describe it. It's really hard, guys. That's why we're just diving
We'll
in.
get to
He
it.
acts in a way that's, shows remorse and guilt and he's
like he's not a fucking psychopath.
Disturbed about his actions the entire time, and he experiences moral dilemmas the entire time. Whereas we don't know the same about David Brooks, and David Brooks acts in a different way. So we'll get to it. We'll get to it. Yeah. And we will preface this by saying, because I already said that a lot of our research today comes from the book The Serial Killer's Apprentice, the true story of how Houston's deadliest murderer turned a kid into a killing machine, by Tracy Ullman and Catherine Ramsland, which we are hoping to do the same thing we did for our last serial killer and actually be able to interview these authors, which we will get into more of this discussion that we've just kind of talked about, I'm sure, with them. So for a special part 3. So you guys will have to stay tuned for that and hot takes throughout.
Yeah.
We're not sorry. So Dean Corll was born Dean Arnold Corll on December 24th, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to parents Mary Robinson and Arnold Corll. He was their first child. And in 1942, he would have another little boy named Stanley together. Dean's father was described as strict with his children, I imagine in a true 1940s fashion. And his mom was very protective of her sons, but overall was not really a coddling mom either. And she, I feel, ignored a lot of warning signs. Mary and Arnold fought frequently, and it is clear that they were very unhappy in their marriage together, leading to their divorce in 1946. So their kids were still quite young. Unable to keep the family home on her own, Mary sold the home and relocated to a trailer park in Memphis, Tennessee. And at the same time, Arnold had been drafted into the war, but they had an amicable enough relationship up until then that she was encouraging of Stanley and Dean to be able to see their dad anytime and have like an open relationship still. Dean was described as being a serious child that rarely socialized with other kids, and people attributed this to him being shy and kind of afraid of rejection and criticism, which he was directed at greatly from his father. He did care about other kids though, and would, express concern if somebody was hurt. Like he didn't show sociopathic tendencies really young. Like he was mostly a normal, quiet kid. When Dean was 7 years old, he suffered rheumatic fever, which is an inflammatory, wow, I can speak, inflammatory condition that can affect the heart, joints, brain, and skin. So your whole body. And it went undiagnosed for a really long time. And then at the same time that he was being diagnosed with this, his doctor discovered that he also had a heart murmur. So he wasn't able to do a lot of physical activities as a kid as a result, play outside, like a true 40s kid. So this isolated him a little bit further from, playing with other kids. When Dean's father returned from the war, his parents tried to reconcile their differences and they remarried in 1950, where they again moved as a family to Pasadena, Texas. And I believe that their parents' intentions were in the right place, but this must have been very difficult and confusing for the whole family when they divorced yet again 3 years later. As with the first separation, Dean and Stanley lived with their mom full time, but they saw their dad regularly as well. Dean's mother, Mary, did the best that she could living on her own, but she was ready to get back out there and have, some added financial and child support as well. She started dating a clock salesman, which I love that that's a job, named Jake J. West, and eventually the two got married. This forced yet another move on her boys, though, traveling to a small town called Vidor, Texas. Don't yell at me, guys. Dean hated his stepfather, though, and having yet another adult in his life to tell him what to do. That, and he couldn't really understand why his mom was so desperate to remarry again and why he and his brother just weren't enough. Jake and Mary went on to have a child of their own in 1955, a little girl named Joyce. And things were starting to look up. The family was relatively happy, living the quote unquote American dream. Mary and Jake opened up a small candy store to run together as a way of supporting their family. And initially, they actually ran it out of the garage of their home before the business started to get a bit bigger. Dean worked helping the family business pretty much from the day it opened. He worked there while he was going to school, and he and his brother Stanley ran the candy making machines and bagged up the candy to go out for deliveries. Jake, his stepdad, would go and deliver all of the orders. Dean was a good student. He was well behaved, but like I said, he was shy and a bit of a loner. He learned to play the trombone in the school's band, and for a really long period of time, that was his only real interest. After graduation in 1958, Dean and his family moved to the Houston area. This is where most of the candy shop orders were being delivered anyway, and it would help save time and cost in Jake driving out there. That, and they were finally able to open up a formal store, moving the business out of the family garage. They named it Pecan Prince, which is a fucking terrible candy store name.
Do you say pecan?
Is this an American Canadian thing?
No, this is a human to human thing.
Is
because we
some
sell
people say
pie.
pecan.
Yeah, I say pecan.
I know. I've heard you say it.
But we sell pie at my store.
Do
at
you?
my store, at Waffle House,
Yeah.
pecan pie. And
Is it
every
good?
single person who comes in says it. I don't know. I don't fucking eat it. But every single person who comes in says it different. And I heard one of my trainees this past week said, a pecan's a toilet. And I was like, what? She said, that's what my grandpa always said. A pecan's a toilet. A pea can. You pee in a can, that's a toilet. And I was like, I'm going to start saying that because it's
That's
clearly
funny.
pecan. Okay.
That's
It's
funny.
pronounced pecan.
I'm sorry. Pecan Prince. It was clear that Dean was feeling a little lost internally. Anytime somebody suggested to his mother that he might, be gay or a little different, she brushed it off, creating even more feelings of rejection about him and his budding sexuality early on. Also, I hate the term sexuality in terms of like a horrendous serial killer, but this is the early years, guys.
I hate the term budding sexuality in general. Fucking hate when people say that.
I'm sorry, I got all clinical
Why is
there.
it budding? I don't like it.
Why is puberty a thing? Okay, we're just here. In 1960, Dean's mother suggested that he should move in with his grandmother in Indiana. She had recently been widowed, and his mom was worried about her mom being all alone. But she also needed to stay and help out with the business. That and things weren't too good between Mary and Jake at this time, so she thought it was best that she stay and help also try and salvage her marriage. Dean would end up moving with his grandma, and during his time in Indiana, he met a young girl. They started dating, and things got pretty serious. Dean decided that he was in love with her, and in true 1960s fashion, a woman's got to find a man and settle down. So he proposed to her in 1962. But she did reject the offer. Maybe because she got the ick from him. After living in Indiana for 2 years and having his heart broken, Dean moved back to the Houston area. He wanted his own space, though, so he moved into the apartment above the candy store that his family ran. But like I said, things weren't really great between Jake and Mary, and they would end up getting a divorce. It was finalized later that same year, with that move out, Mary decided, she's already in the candy business. She's going to start her own. She started her own business, calling it the Corll Candy Company, which I think is a better name for a candy store, but that's just me.
Is that her last name, though?
It was Arnold's last name, so her son's last names.
Yeah, I guess. Listen, I'm just saying right now, I would never name a candy store off my daughter's dad's last name, even if they had the same last name.
True.
But
the reason that she did that was because her boys were basically men at this point. And she puts Dean and Stanley into the business, and they pretty much ran it on their own. Mary trusted them with more and more responsibility as time went on. But maybe this wasn't such a good idea because this is around the time that Dean started to show a darker side. Within the first year, a teenage employee would accuse Dean of sexually harassing him and complain to Mary. She didn't believe that her son would do any of the sort, and her response was firing the teenage boy for slandering her son. First of all, that poor kid, because it takes bravery to come forward. And second of all, that's just instilling in Dean that these kids won't be believed if they come forward and that he can get away with it.
I think we've talked about this before with another serial killer
Probably.
who I don't fucking know. I don't, maybe John Wayne Gacy, but
This case felt very overlappy with so many people we've talked about in a gross way.
You think, and I'm not I don't know this for sure. I don't know her personally or anything, but if being gay wasn't so fucking stigmatized back then,
especially in
maybe
Texas,
she would have believed this kid instead of immediately being like, how fucking dare you call my son gay? Like, that's not the issue, lady. The issue is gay or straight, you cannot sexually harass people. But she immediately went to, don't fucking call my son gay.
Yeah, like she did anytime somebody was like, I think he's gay. Oh, no, he's not. He's not gay.
Yeah.
My son's not gay. It's not creating a good environment. It's not healthy.
No.
And unfortunately, lots of areas of Texas are still like this. So
Lots of areas of America
in general. But this is where our story takes place.
Yeah.
I tried to find a Texas red wine for this episode.
They don't make red wine.
No.
They don't have grapes.
They have harder things. On August 10th, 1964, Dean was drafted into the Army and assigned to go to Fort Polk in Louisiana for training. He was later moved to Benning, Georgia, where he trained to be a radio repairman. And much like the clock salesman, I love that this is a whole ass job within the Army. He was moved for a final time to Fort Hood in Texas. And Dean hated the Army for unknown reasons, but it is wondered whether he had homosexual interactions while he was there, or if he didn't just like this, or if he didn't like the structure or control or whatever it was, something about it. He was not like he was actively rebelling. And after serving almost a year, he applied for a hardship discharge, stating that he was needed at his family's candy store. And he was granted this and discharged in June of 1965.
Fun times.
Now, 24 years old, Dean was finding his footing in the world, but he was also deeply disturbed. He knew that he was gay at this point and had been keeping it a secret for years. Not to mention, like Sierra said, the added stigma of being gay in Texas at this time, and none of his loved ones seeming to accept that. Other than the accusations made by that former teenage employee, the gay community at this time in Texas was quite closeted. He threw himself back into the family business, but it wouldn't be long before Dean would commit unimaginable atrocities. By 1965, the Corll Candy Company was doing well, but in stiff competition with their former business run by their stepfather at the Pecan Prince. As a strategic and, arguably smart business move, the Corll Candy Company moved to a new store directly across from the Helms Elementary School. Of course, this was good for business, but unfortunately, it gave an opportunity for Dean to prey on younger boys. He was also known to give out the odd free piece of candy to kids, and in particular, teenage boys in the community. This earned Dean the nickname the Candy Man. He was also sometimes known as the Pied Piper, but more popularly the Candy Man.
did candy get so popular?
I don't know. Like, I want to say
And
like
is it
1920s, like late 1920s, 1930s was
and is
when.
it his fault that people don't trust Candyman anymore? Because I feel like I'm just picturing like right now, if a candy store was to open up in front of a school, I don't think kids would go there, especially not teenagers. You
Yeah, like
know,
it's not
they'd be like, "What the
cool
fuck is
anymore.
that?"
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like, I'm gonna go ride my
you
skateboard.
fucking weirdo. Why are you putting a candy store by
But
the
I mean,
school?
in the 19 like late
It must have
1940s,
been pretty
early
new.
1950s, it's got to be
Yeah,
like the cool, oh, it's so exciting. I get to go spend my allowance money on this or
yeah,
my paper money on this or yeah. Because let's face it, that was, when penny candies were actually a thing.
right.
Now you got to pay 25 cents per candy. It's bullshit.
25 cents.
Or
Candy
a
here is like
dollar.
$2 a bar. And not
No, no, no,
king
no. For like
size.
little candies, like individual
Yeah.
candies. They don't actually even do that anymore. I'm really quite sad about it. Now they only have like the pre-bagged
Right.
candies unless you actually go to a candy store. If you go to a gas station, you can't like pick your candy like you used to.
Yeah.
I'm making myself sound old here, but if you used to do that as a kid on the weekends, let me know. That's what we spent our allowance money on. We'd go to 7-Eleven after doing yard work with my aunt, and she'd buy us a Slurpee and a small bag of candy. And we'd walk up the hill and be all cute. Okay. But yes, candy is now creepy and not cool.
Right. Right.
Especially in this context. Dean put a pool table into the back of the candy store where he would allow kids to congregate. He also would take them to the beach sometimes in South Texas or to the movies. It was almost like a community center feel. He was loved by the teens and kids in the community because the candy aspect, and he, seemed to care and give them a place to hang out and spend their allowances and hang out after school. But as we know, Dean's intentions is what makes this whole situation sinister. In 1967, Dean met and befriended 12-year-old David Brooks. David was in the 6th grade and was one of the many kids to receive free candy from Dean at one point or another, and he had hung out frequently at the Corll Candy Company. David was groomed from an early age by Dean, showing him that, he could rely on Dean for whatever he needed. If he needed some extra cash, Dean would hand it over. If he wanted to go to the beach, Dean would take him and give him a safe space to hang out. So let's talk about David for a second. Like I said, not a lot of information is known about him personally. So David Owen Brooks was born on February 12th, 1955. He had a bit of a tumultuous childhood, and his parents divorced when he was quite young. They shared custody of him, but they were living 85 miles apart from each other, and David found himself on his own a lot. And Dean took full advantage of that. David was incredibly insecure and got made fun of often for his long, stringy hair and glasses. And he always felt like his parents just tolerated him. That's when Dean came into the picture and he finally felt accepted. As their relationship began to develop, it became more physical. Dean would actually pay David with cash and gifts to let him perform sex acts on him. And by the time that this part of their relationship was evolving, David was 15. And at this point had been pretty much 100% groomed by Dean, who was now in his late 20s. It was also very likely that Dean was doing the same thing in the neighborhood with other boys.
It's gross that Dean Corll was almost, I don't want to say smart, but almost smart in that he knew which kids
To
he could
target.
take advantage of this way. Yeah. he knew enough just by interacting with these kids a couple times that like, okay, this one's gonna work. This is gonna work out.
Yeah, you're insecure and squirrely
Disgusting.
and don't have parents that are watching you.
Yeah.
Dean's mother made the decision to close the Corll Candy Company in June of 1968 and moved to Colorado. Her boys were now on their own, and Dean's mother and his little sister Joyce would move. Dean did remain close with his mom and would talk to her often on the phone. But now needing a new job without the candy company, Dean took a job at Houston Lighting and Power Company as an electrician. He was settled into a new job. He still had his own apartment, and David came over often and was still being taken advantage of by Dean. And unfortunately, this would escalate. Between 1970 and 1973, Dean Corll is known to have killed a minimum of 28 boys between the ages of 13 and 20 years old. Many of these boys were teenagers from low-income neighborhoods in downtown Houston area, and many of these abductions would be assisted by 2 teenage accomplices. We've hinted towards both of them at the beginning already, one of which was David Brooks. And we haven't met the second boy in our story yet. On September 25th, 1970, 18-year-old Jeffrey Conan vanished after hitching a ride from the University of Texas to his parents' house in Houston at approximately 6:15 p.m. Dean Corll offered him a ride, and tragically, he never made it to his final destination. Dean placed a cloth gag in his mouth, and he would die of asphyxiation. He was buried naked, wrapped in plastic, beneath a large boulder at High Island Beach. His body would be found among other boys in August of 1973, after investigators would be led there by David Brooks and our second accomplice. Shortly after Jeffrey's murder, David Brooks would walk in on Dean sexually assaulting 2 teenage boys who were strapped to his 4-posted bed in his apartment. David was promised a car in return for his silence. He was likely scared that the same thing would happen to him and accepted the offer. Dean later bought him a green Chevy Corvette. He would use this vehicle to help Dean in his horrific crimes after being offered $200 for any teenage boy that David could get back to his apartment, which at the time
like Jeffrey Epstein.
Was a lot of money for a teenager, and today that would be about $1,014.
Yeah.
And yes, it does sound like Jeffrey Epstein, and very Jeffrey Epstein of it all as this unfolds. I still feel icky. On December 13th, 1970, David did just that and lured 2 14-year-old boys named James Jimmy Glass and Danny Yates away from a religious rally that was being held in Houston Heights to Dean's apartment. Jimmy knew David in passing and thought nothing of it. He just took him up on his offer to hang out at Dean's house with him. But the boys would be tied to opposite sides of Dean's bed and raped by him before being strangled and buried in a boat shed that Dean rented earlier in November 17th, 1970. 6 weeks later, on January 30th, 1971, David and Dean came upon teenage brothers, Donald and Jerry Waldrop, walking home. The brothers had been driven to a friend's house by their father with plans to discuss forming a bowling league, which is just the most wholesome thing I've ever heard in my life, and had started walking home back in the other direction after learning that their friend wasn't home. This is the day before cell phones. I understand that. And something that I always do that I got from my mom is anytime I drop somebody off, I always wait until they either get inside or come back to the car before I leave because situations like this can happen. I'm not blaming their dad. I'm just saying. It's just. Ugh. Both boys were enticed and lured into Dean's van and driven to his apartment that he had just started renting on Magnum Road. They were raped, strangled, and subsequently buried in the boat shed alongside James and Danny. Donald had run away from home at one point or another, and their parents reported them as missing, but they were labeled as runaways because of this. And this is not the first time we are going to hear this. You're going to be mad at the investigators, guys. 15-year-old Randall Harvey was last seen by his family on March 9th, 1971, after setting off on his bike to go to work. He worked as a part-time gas station attendant, but he never made it after being offered a ride by Dean Corll, and instead was taken back to Dean's apartment where he was shot in the head and buried alongside the other boys in the boat shed. Another student at their school had indicated at one point that David had threatened to shoot Randall in the head over an alleged stolen radio between the two of them, but the school never took it seriously. It's unknown whether David or Dean was the one to pull the trigger in this instance. 13-year-old David Hilligest and 16-year-old Gregory Malley Winkle were heading to a community swimming pool when they were abducted and killed together on the afternoon of May 29th, 1971. Both boys were murdered in Dean's apartment, and police again ruled this set of disappearances as a runaway, but it just didn't add up. Why would you run away with swim trunks? And that's it.
Yeah.
There had also been whispers of an underground gay sex ring in Dallas, Texas, where boys were being kidnapped, bought, and sold. There was also talk of wealthy Californian families purchasing personal boys to have in their homes, where allegedly they were treated very well. No, they're still being assaulted, but nevertheless. Dean would use these whispers and this excuse many times as a way of fear-mongering with both David Brooks and, who we will meet shortly, Wayne Henley. David Hilligest's family was so fearful that this was possibly what happened to their son that they even placed ads in seedy newspapers that went to bad neighborhoods in hopes that somebody knew anything about their son. And Gregory Winkle had worked at the Corll Candy Company at one point as a janitor. So if Dean had been the one to pick them up, he would have gone willingly. He wouldn't have any reason not to. Ah! All right, let's just go all the way to the top of my notes. Rude. Bathing suit. Parents of these missing boys were becoming frantic, and this most recent dual disappearance had the community in a frenzy over their child's safety. In this neighborhood known as the Heights, 180 kids had gone missing, and in Houston alone, 5,080. Parents were putting up missing posters and handing out flyers, but it honestly seems like maybe the Houston Police Department were just really in over their heads. Earlier, I had mentioned a second accomplice. Well, this was 15-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley. He preferred to go by Wayne and had been close friends with David Hilligest since they were little kids. Dean would use David Hilligest's disappearance as a way of instilling fear into Wayne. He would also hold it over his head for the next several years. So let's talk about Wayne for a little bit. Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. was born on May 9th, 1956. He was the first of 4 boys born to Elmer Sr. and Mary. His mom's name was Mary as well. They were 16 years old when they had Wayne, and they actually lived with Mary's parents to save some money. He was a normal kid, running, playing, fishing with other boys in the neighborhood. He was really social and really friendly. And because of his young parents, Wayne spent a lot of time with his maternal grandparents while his parents would work. Into his childhood, siblings would come along. Mary, Wayne's mother, would learn that his father was cheating on her while she was at home pregnant. And Mary's father wasn't having any of that. He took Elmer Sr. under his wing, mentoring him into the family business. Wayne had severe asthma and developed a lot of anxiety around it and the sudden fear of dying. He was also very traumatized by the sudden death of his grandfather when he was 7 years old. Wayne would cope with this loss by reading and escaping into different worlds, but his dad took it really hard. After working with and living with Mary's father for so long, he started to look up to him. And as a method to cope, he began to drink. And when he drank, he became very angry and he would often abuse Mary. Wayne, being the oldest of 4 boys, would defend his mother when he could. At one point, when Mary was backed into a corner with Elmer Sr.'s fist raised, Wayne held a shotgun to his father and told him to stop. Wayne was a good student, but he never felt like he could please his dad. No matter what he did, he never felt like he was good enough. He would later say that it made him feel incredibly small. He was a really, really smart kid. His teachers even encouraged that he skip a grade because he was starting to get bored. After David Brooks met Wayne, he introduced him to his friend Dean Corll. And of course, Dean would offer him the same deal. But he needed to test him a little bit first. Wayne would later tell police that he initially declined Dean's offer to help him and ignored his offer, brushing it off as some sort of sick joke. But gradually, he began to view Dean as something of a big brother type person, whose work ethic he admired and whom he could confide in a world where he felt like he didn't have very much. Wayne's family was going through a really tough time financially at the time that he met Dean. His parents had separated, and his mother, Mary, didn't make enough on her own to support her 4 boys. Wayne really struggled with the decision to participate in the heartbreaking acts that would follow, but he really wanted to help his mom. He had been working odd jobs since he was 10 years old, but nothing was enough to support the family. Wayne's dad was a real piece of shit and refused to pay any child support and did whatever he could to make Mary's life harder by the time that their divorce was finalized. And even though Wayne's dad had become somewhat of a monster, he still really wanted to please his dad. And in turn, he would start really wanting to please Dean. Dean had raped Wayne on one occasion when he didn't do exactly what he was told. And Wayne knew that he couldn't tell anybody about it because they didn't think he would believe him. He would use the threat of selling Wayne into this underground child sex ring as a way to keep him compliant and as a way to convince him to work at all at first. And tragically, we know that places like this really do exist. And Sierra will touch on that a little bit more in part 2, as it is speculated that Dean Corll was more than a little involved.
Feels like Dean is like this cult leader and has completely brainwashed
These 2
Wayne
kids.
and possibly even David. Yeah. We don't know enough about David to I don't know. I don't know enough about David to feel sorry for him.
I feel torn, but I definitely feel sorry for Wayne. Yeah. I still do. And he's 68 years old and in prison. Dean Corll constructed a plywood board with holes in it to better restrain his victims. It also allowed him to get some sleep when they weren't tied to his bed. Like, oh, we can't have you getting a bad sleep, you deranged killer. David Brooks was working fully for Dean at this point and was instructed to look for boys that looked like they were looking for a good time in terms of drugs or alcohol, or kids that were already trouble and wouldn't be missed by their parents. David lived with Dean and wanted for nothing at this point, and Dean, in turn, instructed him what to look for in vulnerable boys, much like he had done with David and Wayne. On August 17th, 1971, Dean and David ran into one of David's acquaintances from school, 17-year-old Reuben Watson Haney, while he was walking away from the local movie theater. Reuben had said hello as he hadn't seen David since David dropped out of school earlier that year. David stopped Reuben outside the theater and invited him to come out and hang out with him and Dean to attend a party. He accepted, but there was no party. Instead, he would be strangled, tortured, and buried in the boat shed. In September of 1971, Dean moved to a different apartment closer to the city. This would mean less drive time from opportune meetings, going back to his place, and less room for something to go awry. Also, a larger pool. In February or early March of 1972, according to the statement given to police by Wayne Henley, he and Dean picked up a boy at the corner of 11th and Studwood downtown and lured him to Dean's home with the promise of smoking some marijuana with the two. At Dean's house, using the ruse that they had learned to perfect, Wayne cuffed his own hands behind his back and freed himself with a key hidden in his back pocket. He then challenged the young boy into trying to do the same. But once the handcuffs were on, Dean bound and gagged him. Wayne left the room after this, believing that Dean was selling these boys into the sex slave ring that he had been told about time and time again. He had no idea at this point that they were being killed. Not that the alternative was much better, but you know what I mean. The identity of this first victim Wayne helped with remains unknown to this day. A month later, on March 24th, 1972, Dean, David, and Wayne ran into 18-year-old Frank Aguirre, leaving the restaurant that he had worked at. Wayne called him over to Dean's van to say hi, as they had known each other through mutual friends, and Wayne asked Frank if he wanted to come have a few beers with them and smoke some weed at Dean's apartment. Frank said that it sounded like fun and got into the van. They all enjoyed hanging out for a little bit before Frank picked up a pair of handcuffs on the table and asked what these were all about. Dean took this opportunity to ambush Frank, pushing his head into the table and handcuffing him. Dean would rape, torture, and murder Frank, despite Wayne pleading with Dean not to hurt him, as reported by him in a later interview in 2010. David and Wayne would help Dean move Frank's body and bury him at High Island Beach. And we've seen it a few times already, but the victims were familiar with either Dean, David, or Wayne in some way or another from the candy store, from school, and thus these boys had really no reason to have their guard up at all. That, and in many of these instances, it was David and Wayne luring them to Dean's apartment. What reason would you have not to trust a fellow teenager? 17-year-old Mark Stephen Scott knew both Wayne and David when he was taken to Dean's home on April 20th, 1972. Mark was forced to write a letter to his parents and sign it, stating that he had found a job in Austin and would be moving right away. Mark was strapped to the torture board and was raped and strangled before being buried at High Beach as well. Unfortunately, his body was never able to be recovered. And this is the first murder that Dean would make Wayne participate in as a way to test him. And this is when he finally learned what was really going on. In the book written by Tracy and Catherine, Wayne was reported as saying that he was a religious person and believed that he was going to be smited instantly for what he had done. Dean manipulated Wayne by saying that if he could have power over people, his dad would leave him and his mom alone. The more Wayne was manipulated into helping Dean as well, the more implicated he became in the crimes. If Dean went down, so did Wayne and David. It was also his word against Dean's, a kid versus an adult. And Wayne was incredibly scared of the same thing happening to him. He had been taught good morals and had been taught right from wrong. He knew that people had died because of him. Anytime Dean tried to get Wayne to participate in raping any of these boys, Wayne was not at all interested. He didn't even want to be in the room when anything bad was happening, but continued to bring boys to Dean because he wanted to please him, and he also desperately needed the money. Wayne would begin to spiral, coping with alcohol. He went from almost a straight A student to very lost, very traumatized, and eventually would drop out. David Brooks would later recall that Wayne went dark when helping with the murders. He thought that this was him enjoying it, but in my personal opinion, based on the statements, I think it was more of a disassociation thing.
Yeah,
But
I agree.
We don't really know. And he was quoted as saying that he was fascinated at people's stamina when being tortured. That doesn't mean he enjoyed it, but it's just an observation. On May 21st, 16-year-old Johnny Ray Dellum was last seen walking towards a local store after leaving a friend's house. He came into contact with Dean and was brought back to his home, where he was actually kept alive for about a month, along with another boy named Billy Jean Bulk, age 17. He had actually worked the Dean Corll Candy Company at one point as well. On June 26th, both Johnny and Billy would be tied on either side of Dean's bed. Wayne would strangle Billy in front of Johnny before yelling, "Hey, Johnny," and shooting the teen in the forehead.
Jesus.
Both boys were buried at High Island Beach. Dean taught Wayne to act purposefully and with intention. He also taught him how to shoot a gun. A few weeks later, the trio lured a 19-year-old named William Rigner to the house. William was tied to the plywood torture board when he was tortured and abused by Dean. David later claimed that he tried to persuade Dean to let William go, which miraculously he did. The next time David entered the house, though, Wayne knocked him unconscious. He was then tied to Dean's bed and assaulted by Dean repeatedly before being released. It was almost like a beating into submission after convincing him to let William go. On July 19th, Stephen Kent Sickman was leaving a party when he was picked up by Dean. He came back to Dean's for some drinks and was instead severely beaten, suffering fractured ribs. He was then strangled with a nylon cord that was left on his body when he was buried in the boat shed. He was only 17 years old. On August 21st, 19-year-old Roy Bunton was abducted while walking to his job as an assistant at a Houston shoe store. He had been gagged with a section of a towel with his mouth taped closed, and he had been shot twice in the head before being buried in the boat shed. On October 3rd, 1972, Wayne and David encountered two teenagers, Wally J. Simino and Richard Hembry. walking to Richard's house to hang out. They were enticed into David's Chevy and taken back to Dean's apartment. That evening, Wally called his mom saying "Mom" into the receiver before the phone went dead. He was 14 years old and Richard was 13.
Goodness.
The following morning, Richard was shot in the head by Wayne with the bullet exiting through his neck. Several hours later, both boys were strangled and buried in graves directly above the bodies of Jimmy Glass and Danny Yates in the boat shed. In November of 1972, 18-year-old Willard Branch, known to both Dean and Wayne, disappeared while hitchhiking to Mount Pleasant in Houston. And this is a little trigger warning. His penis was cut off and he was strangled and buried in the boat shed. His father was actually a police officer for the Houston police, and he died of a heart attack while searching for his missing son. On
So
November,
sad.
I know. I'm like, oh, skip right past that. Okay. It is really sad. On November 11th, a 19-year-old named Richard Kempner disappeared on his way to a phone booth to call his fiancée. Richard had been working as a carpenter's apprentice and was calling to let his future wife know that it was going well. Tragically, he was strangled and buried at High Island Beach. In a haunting later recollection, the woman that rented out the boat shed to Dean said that he had requested renting a second shed because he was, quote, running out of room there. And that brings us to the end of 1972, and that is where we are going to end part 1, because this has been a lot.
Yeah.
But before we roll on out of here and before we get to part 2 next week, Sierra, do you have anything happy going on in your life?
I'm
Or
going to
something you're looking
Cincinnati
forward to? Oh,
for a
yeah.
week.
That is
So
exciting.
excited.
You get to see your brothers and your mama.
Mhm.
The last time Sierra was there, guys, I was also there. So
Yeah, it's been an entire year.
that's crazy. Well,
Yeah.
I know I miss you, but I know you definitely miss your family.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any big plans? And your niece and your nephews too. We get to see them.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
We're going to a Luke Combs concert. That'll be fun.
Nice. For Sissy's
Yeah.
birthday.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that was happening in Cincinnati. Is your mom
Mhm.
going with you?
Yes.
Nice. That'll be exciting.
It's gonna be fun. I also get to go to my stepmom's spa and watch some facials, learn some things.
Nice,
So,
nice.
yeah,
All good things.
all good things.
I'll call that a positive.
Yep.
I am having a hard time thinking of anything positive right now, given my last
Come
24
on.
hours.
There's gotta be
Um,
something.
My something positive, I will say, mm,
Future. We're not dwelling on the past. Future.
this weekend I get to see my aunt and uncle, the aunt that I grew up with and uncle I grew up with on their property. And I'm also excited to see the new Deadpool with Kevin.
Nice. Those are good things. I'm a little sad. When does Deadpool come out?
Tomorrow.
Okay, never mind then. I'll be able to watch it. I mean, be able to. I'm gonna watch it anyway. But Jesse told me, he was like, just so you know, as soon as it's purchasable, I'm purchasing it. And I was like, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah,
I
I'm not
also
objecting.
want to see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was nervous that it was going to come out while I was in Cincinnati and he was going to watch it without me. So I'm glad it'll be this weekend. I'll watch it with him.
He would. Well,
He
might.
100% would.
Well, guys, we hope that you're also able to go and watch the new Deadpool. And when you do, let us know how you liked it. I'm sure we will discuss it on the next month's Bitch and Wine over on Patreon.
Mhm.
And if you are craving some more of us and something more lighthearted, you can check out our Patreon. We do fun stuff over there. And we have hundreds of bonus episodes if you've run out and you're all caught up now. If you like the episode, also go and leave a 5-star rating and review. It really is the best way to spread the word about the podcast. And friendly reminder to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to the podcast as well, because that really helps us and it avoids you missing out on any new content because Apple is fucking weird. Don't know why.
Yes.
And it helps us on Spotify as well if you're able to follow the show that, and you get notified when a new episode is out, and that's fun as well because we do bonuses from time to time. And we will see you next week for part 2. And in the meantime, keep it twisted.
Twisted and Uncorked is a proud member of Weirding Way Media. Hosted and produced by Sierra Zorn and Alicia Watson. If you like the show, don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you are listening now. It really is the best way to spread the word. You can check out all things Twisted on our website, twistedanduncorked.com, and we will see you next Tuesday for a brand new episode.